Hello and welcome to the Blender lighting tutorial, video 3. This is the third video now. I'm going to be talking about material. I just slap my... Every single time I slap my microphone. Okay. So today I'm going to be talking about materials and nodes and all that good stuff. All the stuff that a lot of people struggle with because it's confusing, and it's perfectly right to be confused about it. It is a very confusing topic. Materials and nodes in general, they're just confusing. They're not easy to deal with in the slightest, but I'm going to be trying my best to explain to you how to use them to the most basic extent, because they're obviously very complicated things and it's not easy to just immediately know what to do. So I want to do a brief breakdown on what a material actually is. I'll try to keep this short. So a material basically just determines how, like, what you see, like this cube. This cube here has no material currently. I'm in the material tab, which, by the way, we've been messing with all these tabs throughout the videos. The material tab is this one down here. Kind of looks like a radioactive symbol. That's what I like to call it, at least. So the materials of an object basically tell Blender how to utilize certain aspects of this menu down here, nodes. You basically, it tells Blender what the object is going to look like when lighting and all that good stuff is applied to it. And you can do all sorts of stuff with nodes. You can use nodes to add color to object. You use nodes to add textures. You basically use it to customize the way it looks. So you have modeling customizes the shape, materials customizes the look. That's a very simple rundown of what a material is. Now, solid mode is typically used for modeling because it's a very simple way where there's no, the lighting isn't really biased. It kind of like adjusts depending on what side you're looking at. And it's just easy to see what you're doing from a geometric standpoint. Material mode, which once again is the radioactive kind of symbol. Material mode allows you to view what something would look like with this menu, and it allows you to view the way something would look. And in this menu, lighting is subjective. In fact, you can actually change where the lighting point is coming from by rotating it here. This is not really important. None of this is really that important. I'll be getting into these two check marks, but nothing here is really that important. By default, this is turned on when you go into the shading tab. I just slide this off because it is really annoying to just stare at that as your background, so I just turn that off. So, nodes. Nodes are what you use to make the material a material. So the nodes don't show up until you add a material, so let's actually go ahead and add a new material. And now you'll see you get this giant scary properties menu. There's two ways you can edit nodes. You can either edit them using the side menu, which is very annoying, although it's doable, or you can use the node menu, which is a lot more easier to visualize and understand. So we're going to be using this menu. I'm actually going to drag this up so you can see it better. So this is the principled node. The principled node is now the new default node that gets added when you create a new material in Blender, which is honestly such a great thing, because before they added a diffuse node, which I'll quickly add for you. Before they added a diffuse node, which is just simply an output of color and not much else. This node has a lot of different properties, and I'm actually very happy that this is now the node that they used for this task, because it's so much better in every single way. It basically takes a bunch of shader nodes that already exist and combines them all into one node. I'm actually going to put a screenshot on the screen right now of a little diagram that I made showing you what each value on the principled node corresponds to in an actual shader node. Because all of these correspond to already existing separate shader nodes in this menu here. But a lot of them, not all of them, because obviously there's a lot of shader nodes that we can use, but a lot of them, most of the really important ones, have all been combined into one node that's now this node, which makes it so much easier to understand, so you don't have to try to remember the names of all of these nodes. You just have to remember the names of the properties on this one node. So it just makes life a whole ton easier in general. So allow me to just kind of go through the properties of these nodes, and like I'm just gonna go through all of them one by one, very briefly to some extent, so that I can actually do something in this video, and you don't have to listen to me rant about this node for like half an hour. So I'm gonna skip subsurface for now because I feel like that's a property that I should talk about later. But we're gonna go down to metallic, specular, and roughness. Roughness is, I'm going to start with roughness. I'm going to do it in increasing complexity. So roughness is the simplest one to understand. It's basically how much a object resists reflecting something. So right now this object is reflecting a little bit. As you can see on the top, there's like a little bit of a shimmer coming off of it. If I were to turn the roughness up to 1, you'd see that shimmer would completely disappear. And if I would turn it down, that shimmer would increase, and eventually it would start to actually become a mirror. When the roughness is put all the way down, the object that you have is become basically a perfect mirror, because there's nothing resisting the reflection. So it just becomes an embodiment of perfect reflection, which is considered a mirror. So by default, it's set to 0.5. Depending on what you're making, you would want to have this resistance to reflection to be, you know, higher or lower. Specular is similar to roughness, but it's a little bit different. Specular is how much an object actually reflects. So if you have specular all the way down, the roughness slider isn't going to do anything, because the roughness slider is the resistance to reflection. But if specular is turned off, the object can't reflect at all. So specular can basically determine how much of that reflection you want to actually see on an object. So if I were to put this to not a very rough value, and then let's say I wanted it to like reflect, but like this is a lot of reflection, so like let's turn it down a little bit. And you'd see now it reflects significantly less, but it still has that same look, it just doesn't reflect as much. So these two kind of go hand in hand. They're very important. They're paired together in most scenarios. Metallic is basically, it's basically exactly what it sounds like. It basically makes the material look like metal. Now, when you have metallic enabled, metallic and specular, you don't want to mix, because it ends up looking really weird, because the metallic and the specular are the same property, except one is for when you're making non-metallic materials and one is for when you are. So when messing with metallic, I would say put the metallic slider all the way up, so that you're not mixing the natural look of specular with metallic. Either have metallic at 0 or just 1, and then have specular slider at 0 when metallic slider is turned to 1. Anywhere in between, you see how this kind of just like doesn't really look right. It just like it's like a mix of metal and not metal. And if you're making a metallic material, you really don't want to see that. So just putting this all the way up is a good idea. And then from here, you can use roughness to, you know, control the resistance to the reflection. So this is like a typical metal kind of. And then if you want to make it a little bit more shiny, you can just lower this down a little bit. And that's basically metallic. That's as simple as metallic gets, really. So I'm going to put this back up a little bit so we can get that shiny material back. Kind of like a tiny shiny cube. All right. Sheen. What sheen is supposed to be, it's supposed to be like a tiny coat of metallic, like a tiny coat of a metallic layer on top of the regular object. Although, from my experience, it hasn't really done anything. Like, turning on the it hasn't done anything for me throughout my experiences, so I've just never really played with this slider. Clear coat is a little bit easier to understand. Clear coat is essentially, it's kind of like adding a coat of paint to an object. So it's like something like a fresh car, like a newly painted car, or like porcelain, you know, stuff like that. And then you have a roughness slider for the clear coat, so you can kind of have like two specular maps on one object. So let's say this is a relatively rough object with like very little reflection, and it's a pretty rough object, but it has a clear coat, so it appears reflective on top of the not reflective material. So it kind of just adds a second layer of specular. That's essentially what that does. Transmission makes it so that light can pass through the object, which you can't really tell that it's doing it in material viewport. It's kind of impossible to see. You can only really see it in rendered viewport and when there's a light around. And then roughness, the transmission roughness is how blurred something is when looking through the transmission of an object. And IOR is a value that basically determines how much light will refract when looking through a translucent object. I'll put a screenshot on the screen now showing you like a key of IOR values. The 1.45 is pretty good for most scenarios, so you probably won't really ever have to change this number, but just know that it's a value that determines how much light will be refracted through a translucent object. That's basically all you need to know. I have struggled to pronounce this word multiple times, but this word right here, anistrophic, I think that's how you say it. But anistrophic is that look that something has when it's is the look that something has, you know, like the look that the bottom of a pan would have. It's basically that look. I don't think I can preview it in the. I don't think I'm able to preview it in the material viewport, but I'll show on screen some photos of anistrophic. See, anistrophic. I don't know how to say it. So you have that kind of an effect. Oh, I can get over here on the side. Never mind. So here's on the side. Here's on the side. So you see, you have this here. Oh, I can also show off the transmission too. See that? And then IOR, it refracts more or refracts less. And then transmission roughness affects the blurriness. So that's that. So back to this. So this only works when you have metallic enabled, because the metallic, you can't have this when it's not metallic. And then the rotation basically allows you to control where it's located on the object. So like this would be kind of like the pot and pan look. Yeah, that. You guys probably understand what I'm talking about when I show you this. It's a pretty common effect you see in everyday life. So that's there. And that pretty much covers all the sliders here. Specular tint and a specular tint is out of the tints. Specular tint's the only one you really have to worry about. Specular tint is basically when something is specular, when it reflects off of an object, it will correspond to whatever is in the world background. But if you turn on specular tint, the reflections will be based off of the color of the object. So if I were to change this color to, like, say, blue, and you see how the reflection is white because it's corresponding to the world background. If I were to turn the tint on for specular, it doesn't really show it in the material viewport, but if I were to turn the tint on, it'd become more of a bluish reflection because it'd be corresponding to the color of the object. So if you basically want the reflection to be more correspondent to the object itself and not the surroundings of the object, that's when you would use this value. Pretty simple stuff, not too complicated. So that's that. Alpha. Okay, we have two, I have two more things to talk about, and then I'm gonna jump back up to subsurface. Emission only really works when you plug another node into it, because this is just a color and you can't really control a value with this. So with emission, if you wanted to get the emission to work, you would have to plug in a hue saturation value node, which I'll explain what this node is later in the video, hopefully. And basically this will allow you to convert this color input to be both a color input and a value input, because these two things in this case, the hue, saturation, and the factor don't really matter at all. What matters is the value. So you would change the color, and then you could change this value to, you know, make it glow as, you know, you want it to. And what makes this better than regular emission node is because with this you can actually have a custom material that glows at the same time. So I could make this metallic and stuff, and it would still glow on top of the metallic properties. So it's pretty cool how you can mix the two perfectly using this node. And then alpha is just how transparent an object is, and in order to show you that, I would have to go into settings, viewport display, and you would have to change blend mode to alpha clip. and this will essentially allow for transparency in the viewport because it's not turned on by default. This basically determines how, oh wait, not alpha clip, alpha hashed, wrong one, alpha hashed. That's the one you want to turn it to. This will basically determine how transparent an object is. Not translucency, not light can pass through, but how visible it actually, like, physically is. So this will, you know, if you turn it down to 0, it's just invisible. And, you know, that's alpha. It's just transparency. So that pretty much wraps up the principled node. Oh, I almost forgot to talk about subsurface scattering. Subsurface scattering is basically when light refracts around the edge of an object. So you see how this cube has very sharp defined edges. If I were to turn subsurface scattering on, you would see those sharp edges. Light would kind of refract around the edges and create this kind of effect. If you don't want any discoloration like you have in human skin, which is why it looks like this by default, if you want to get human skin, actually, you would have to take this value. You would have to put them all at 1 and then take this value and turn it to 2. Then you would get a perfect red tint everywhere. But if you don't want any tinting at all, you can just turn all of these to 1. But if you want the human skin red tint, you turn that to 2. So that's subsurface scattering in a nutshell. And obviously, I wouldn't recommend putting it this high. I'd put it like 0.1 at most if you're going to use it. You don't typically use subsurface scattering very often because very few objects in real life actually have this property, which is why I was kind of reluctant to even talk about it in general. But I just thought it'd be important to tell you what it is. And then subsurface color is the color that the subsurface itself emits. Obviously, for the most part, you're going to want these two colors to be the exact same, because there's not really a circumstance where you want them to be different. Alright, so now that we have this basic knowledge of, you know, the principled node in mind, so we're going to go to the other files and actually apply these materials to some of these scenes. So let's go to the outdoor lighting one first, the one from all the way back from video 2. Which we haven't touched in a long time. We have some pretty good lighting going on here. Obviously, Blender 2.9 has come out now since the start of this tutorial. So I'm in Blender 2.9 now, although not a lot has changed, if I'm being honest. But you know, stuff here and there has. But we're gonna go ahead and add some materials to the already existing MC prep materials that we did in the first node video. So I'm gonna pick a few random objects in the scenery, such as I don't know. Let's start with grass/dirt, kind of the same thing. So let's think about dirt for a second. Dirt's gonna be the first one I do. So dirt obviously isn't a very shiny object, typically speaking, not very shiny object at all. So we would want the specular value, logically speaking, to be a much lower number. By the way, you can just delete this node. It doesn't do anything. It just gets plugged into the roughness for no reason. So, specular node, obviously, you know, dirt's not very shiny. So the specular, the ability for it to reflect, you would want that to be a lower number so that it doesn't reflect a lot. And in terms of roughness, now that the specular is put way down, the roughness doesn't affect it as much. But even then, you know, dirt's very coarse, it's very rough, it's a very rough object. You'd want this number to be a higher number. Obviously, you don't really put any of these at 0 or 1 because you want there to be at least some balance between the two. You don't want it to be all roughness and no specular because obviously dirt has some specular and it doesn't have all roughness. So you don't ever want to have like one of these all the way down and one of them all the way up, with the exception being metallic, because then you're kind of, the balance isn't kept as well. So I'm going to do the exact same thing with grass block. The exact same material is going to be applied to grass block. Let me go find something that's actually not rough. Like, ooh, we can do stone. Think about stone. Stone is pretty flat, especially in Minecraft where there's no variation. Everything's just flat. Although we can add variation through the use of bump maps, which I will get to. It'll be the one vector thing we do in the entire video. I probably won't touch vector at all, really, besides bump maps. So with stone, stone is actually pretty shiny, thinking about it logically, because stone is a pretty smoothed down material, but it's not like crazy shiny. So I'd probably keep this at like 0.3 and maybe the roughness at like 0.6, maybe 0.7. Actually 0.7 was a pretty good number. So now you have a little bit of a different variety. You're probably wondering, why does all of this matter? Because like nothing is really changing that much. The only things that are going to drastically change are the water, the lava, and the leaves. But the reason why you want to do this is because you just want to give your scene a little bit more life to it. Because if everything's just the same material, everything's just going to look like it's made of plastic. Because you know, when we made the render before, when we rendered the original image, everything had the exact same material and everything looked like it honestly looked really boring. Like, it didn't look all that amazing. It generally looked like it was made of plastic. This allows you to create some variation in the way that the world looks to make it look more appealing to the eye. And that's why you want to take the effort in going in and doing all of this. Oh my god, I almost completely forgot to mention the AO node. So in 2.8, you know how a lot of people, to add AO, they would use the AO pass. In 2.8, they made a node for AO, and it is so much better than anything we've ever had previously with AO. So AO can just be made so simple with this node. It's just look at how well it's rendered too. It renders super high quality AO, and you don't even have to worry about it being a compositing pass. It's just all in a node now. So go ahead and add that to all the materials that you believe need AO. I typically add it to everything that's not transparent, because the transparency with AO doesn't really go together very easily. So I typically don't add it to that, but everything else I typically add AO to. AO basically, if you don't know what AO is and you don't know what I'm talking about, AO is essentially kind of like it's an outline, it's a black outline that surrounds the edges of an object when it reaches the corner of something else. So it's like the shadow that a corner of a room makes. So you ever look at the corner of a room and you notice that it's significantly darker than everywhere else in the room? That's because of ambient occlusion. It's basically like this effect where the corners of an object are darker than its center. And adding this to, especially in voxelized art, adding this to voxelized art adds a lot of depth to the image. Look at how much depth we've added already by just adding it to those 4 blocks, because obviously sand, grass, and dirt are everywhere in this scene. So just by adding it to that alone, we've changed a lot when it comes to, the way the scene looks. Look at how much in depth the hill looks now compared to when this was turned off. It adds so much depth to the image. Now, I'm gonna go ahead and add the materials to the way I see fit to everything else in the scene besides the grass, the leaves, the lava, and the water, because I need to get to that individually since those are specialized materials. But all the other blocks I'm now going to go through and add materials to all of them. I'm not doing much different than what I've already explaining. I'm just setting up an AO node and I'm changing these 2 settings. That's really all I'm doing. Not changing much else. Maybe a little bit here and there. Maybe I'll add a special little doohickey, but most of the time it's going to be just me adjusting these 3 values. So without further ado, go. Oh, I thought it just... that was a very short time in between the time lapse. I thought I'd just take a brief moment to say that if something is very obviously not in frame, or it's like not visible from the camera in any means necessary, you can very well just skip it on this list. Like iron ore, iron ore, and coal ore. Are you really gonna see that in this scene? Unless there's like actually like a place where you see the object that you're adding the material to. Unless that is the case, most of the time you're just not going to add a material. So if you see stuff like iron, like the ores and stuff, and it's like it's an above ground scene, you can be pretty confident that you can just leave those blank. Basically, if there's a block that you see that you know distinctly is not in the scene anywhere, and it's just not going to be in the frame, like sandstone, I don't see any sandstone anywhere, so I'm gonna leave this one blank. So like I said, Just you keep in mind what you're adding materials to so you don't accidentally use more time than you need to. Okay, so I just went ahead and added materials to everything that's not specialized. So it actually wasn't a lot because there's not a lot in this scene, and I actually skipped over a ton of them because a lot of them I couldn't actually find that block anywhere within my visual eyesight range. So now just with that alone, despite the fact that we haven't set up the specialized materials, look at how much depth has been added to the image now. Now that we've kind of like done that, it's a lot more sophisticated, and like everything we've done is a lot more sophisticated than it was before. And you know, that's mostly in part to the fact that adding materials just makes the scene in general look a lot more appealing to the eye. So now that we understand this, before I get into specialized materials, I thought I'd actually briefly explain bump maps because, you know, those are pretty cool and a lot of people want to know how to use them. So I'm going to put my example on sand, since sand is a very detailed block. So let's go over to the desert. There's a lot of it. So sand. My FOV really high? No, it's not. Okay, now you can see more. Okay, so sand. So how you would add a bump map. A bump map is basically where you use the data given from the image of the texture to create bumps in the texture that basically affect the way lighting affects the object. And you would use data from either a texture node or an image in this case, because we're using an image texture. So you would add a node called a bump node. And basically what this does is this converts texture data into vector data. And vector data is a direction. Vector means direction. So it turns it into directional data, so you can use bumps. You can use the directional data to create bumps that actually change the way lighting acts because it's a directional data point. So we would plug the color of this texture into the height of the bump. So now this now determines the height of the bumps. And now we plug this vector into this vector. And now you can see the sand becomes bumpy. Now obviously this is a crazy amount of bumps. It looks a lot more intense in material mode than it actually is in the lighting. The lighting makes it look a lot more tame. But even with this, you don't want it being this intense. This is way too bumpy for sand. Sand is typically a flat-ish kind of object, so you'd want to adjust this accordingly. So like sand is flat, but it's a little bit bumpy, so I would say maybe like 0.2, 0.3, kind of like this kind of area. 0.35 maybe. So you have like this very minor, the bumps are there, but they don't have as much as an impact as they would before. Now, if you want the bumps to be less pixelated like they are here, you can change this from, you can make it so that this is a different image. You can duplicate that with Shift D, plug this out, and then turn this into a linear image, and then plug this into here. And it would be using a linear output to create the bump map instead of a closest output. So if you wanted the bump maps to be like less pixelated. I typically don't utilize this because I think it just looks kind of weird. I typically just use the regular pixelated bump map that you get with this one because it looks kind of nice, and honestly I don't have many problems with it, so this is just the one I use. Personally speaking, I'm actually not going to do this because I feel like it doesn't really make sense when doing it on world objects. It only makes sense when you're putting it on like specific set objects that are designed to be seen from a close-up perspective. Because when you're not, if your scene takes place, say, in this forest, you're never gonna see this area. So like adding bump maps to the world isn't really necessary unless the objects that you're seeing are actually gonna be in the scene. So typically I only add the bump maps if it's on like a customized modeled set and not the actual world that, you know, the video or animation is taking place in. So I don't typically utilize bump maps unless it's for, you know, custom models. So now let's get into specialized materials. I'm gonna do the easiest one first. We're gonna do the grass/leaves material. So let's start with oak leaves. Now leaves are an interesting object because leaves are translucent. which isn't actually a feature on this principal node, which is why this is the one node that you're really going to have to use besides principal node, the the translucent node, this node. So how are we going to make it so that this material is translucent on top of it being, you know, everything else that it already is? It's pretty simple, actually. This is determining the alpha shaders. So this is basically, it's mixing the principal data with the transparent data, and it's basically saying, and then using the alpha mask from the image texture, basically saying the parts of the image that are transparent, make them actually transparent utilizing this node, and then the parts of the image that aren't transparent, make them this. And that's essentially what this is doing. A mix shader allows you to mix two nodes together and using a data point or just a fixed number to determine how the two of them should be shared amongst the material. Add shader simply just takes two shaders. I just did that by accident. Takes two shaders and adds them on top of each other without any sort of factoring in between. And this is the node that we're going to be using to create this translucent effect. So you just add the translucent effect on top of the principled effect. So plug this into here so that it's using the color is using the texture data, and plug this into here. And now you have translucent leaves, which make them look very different in the rendered viewport. As you can see, light kind of passes through them instead of just hitting them and reflecting back off. Light kind of like passes through it as it would in real life. Then we're going to want to add back-facing deletion, because in the actual game of Minecraft, when you look through a leaf block, you're not able to see the other sides of the leaf block through that one side. And this is an effect that you can actually achieve in Blender. It's called backface curling. Basically how you would do it is we're going to take another mix shader, plug it on top of this one, and we're going to do the same thing we did before where we did the transparent data with the regular data. And now, basically what we're going to do is we're going to take a node called geometry, which basically allows you to use data points to change the way an object's geometry looks. It's like physical form, its faces. And we're going to utilize the data point back facing to tell Blender when you're looking at the back faces, make them transparent. And when you're looking at the front faces, make them this material. And by doing that, we can basically create that exact effect that's actually done in game, where you cannot see the faces from behind. And this basically makes the leaves look a lot more transparent and a lot less like tightly packed together. As you can see now, the leaves don't look as packed. They actually look more like leaves, you know, slightly see-through, until of course more blocks show up on top of them. So that's essentially how you would create the specialized material that is leaves. And for leaves, I would leave AO out, because leaves are meant to be transparent looking, and if you add AO, it kind of like removes that effect. And then for everything related to grass kind of stuff, like dandelion, flowers, grass, dead bushes over there, sugarcane, any of those like transparent, like half transparent objects, you do the exact same thing I just did, except you would leave out the back-facing part. So you would add shader, and then translucent, and then plug that into here. So you do the exact same thing I just did, but you just leave out the back-facing part, because these things don't need back-face curling. And essentially, this just makes this kind of stuff look more realistic, because technically, all of this stuff here is also translucent. So it just makes all of that look more realistic. Like, look at this versus the tall grass, which doesn't have the translucency. And obviously this you wouldn't add AO to either, because it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So I'm going to go ahead and add this translucent specialized material to everything else that needs it. Now we have the leaf specialized material and the grass specialized material. So now you can see all of this is starting to come together. It looks a lot more lively than it did before. The only thing that's missing now is pretty obvious: the water. The water looks really dull and boring. So we're going to do something pretty darn exciting. We're going to make a water shader. Yes. Yes, I'm not kidding. We are going to make a water shader. And for the water shader, I'm actually going to delete everything here, and we are going to start this material entirely from scratch, because that's typically what you need to do for a water shader. Water shader is not even going to utilize the Minecraft water texture at all. We are going to create a full-on realistic water shader. No Minecraft water texture at all. So what should be the first thing we do here? Well, realistically, let's add a principal node, since that's the go-to node for all Blender materials. So this is going to be water. So let's think about what we want water to look like. Water is obviously blue, although it's not ridiculously blue unless the water is extremely deep, which in this case, we're just dealing with a river. So just a small tint of blue would be feasible enough. Don't want to make it a crazy amount of blue, considering this is only a river, it's not an ocean. So the amount of blue you would add would be very minimal. Obviously, water is a perfect mirror, so we're gonna put the roughness all the way down. So we get the perfect mirror that is water. And specular, in this case, specular, water is pretty darn specular, so I'd keep that all the way up, actually, in this scenario. But the one thing we want to deal with when it comes to water is the fact that water is transparent, or transmissive, I should say. In this case, we're gonna turn this one up. And with that, we've kind of created a transmissive material that, you know, light goes through this as if it was water. And this by itself does kind of resemble water in the sense that it doesn't have any sort of waves at all. And if we were to turn refractive caustics back on, which I know I have them turned off, light would pass through this more easily, with the obvious problem being the quality of the render is just completely gone. We would have to bump up this one a ton to get that quality back. You see, now it's looking a little better. The IOR of water, this is just a value that I just know off the top of my head, but the IOR of water is 1.33. That's just the scientific IOR value of water, because IOR is actually a scientific value. I'm pretty certain it's an acronym. Don't know what the acronym actually means. But with this, we've kind of created a very basic water material. Like, this looks like water, you would say. So let's go ahead and actually make it wavy. So how are we going to do that? Well, you probably instinctively think it probably has something to do with this node. And you'd be right, it does have something to do with this node. So we're going to utilize a noise texture, which a noise texture basically looks like this. A noise texture is essentially a texture node that generates randomly generated noise in the form of light and dark values. And we're going to use this node to create our waves. So let's go ahead and take a noise texture, plug it in for the height of the bump, and plug the bump into the normal. And this will create a very, very basic look for what we want our waves to look like. Now, right now, the noise texture is extremely small, so we're going to want to bump this number up a bit. Now, obviously, there are other details on this noise texture node that you're going to want to mess around with if you want this water to look better, because obviously this looks like water, but it doesn't really look like river water. It just kind of looks like water you'd see in like a pot or a pan just sitting on like a counter. So what we're going to do is we're going to bump this number down a bit to the point where it's almost completely flat, like almost unnoticeable amount of waves. So it's maybe a number like 5 or 4. So now the amount of variation in the water is very little because this is a river and it's relatively calmer waters. But what we're going to do is we're going to turn the detail, this value here, up to 8. So now you have more detailed variation. It's kind of like, it kind of subdivides the noise texture a little bit and creates this little bit of variation. And if you want to adjust how much subdivision there is, you would want to mess with this roughness node, this roughness part of the node. In which case, you know, it would just create more roughness. In this case, I'm actually going to turn this down a little bit. I'm going to turn this, my Blender crashed, so like a bunch of my settings got removed. All right. In this case, I'm actually going to turn the roughness down a little bit to like 0.4. So now you have like a little bit of color. Actually, no, I changed my mind. I'm gonna put it up a little bit. So you have like a little bit of a water kind of aesthetic going on here. Now, if you want the water to look a little bit less flat, you can add in between these two a bright nope, that's brick texture. A bright contrast node in the middle. Once it loads. And you can turn the contrast of the entire noise texture up a bit, which allows for the waves to kind of like poke out a little more, like so you can see them better from the side view. So if we were to go into render viewport with these settings now, of course caustics are turned off because my Blender crashed, you would get something like this. And you know, this looks a lot more like water now. And obviously if I turn the subsurface on, or no, the subsample of transmission up, we get better caustics. So this looks a lot more like transmission now. This looks a lot more like water now. So we've basically created, I don't know where the hell I am now. Okay, so we basically created some basic water. And obviously you can mess with these settings as you wish to, you know, change the way the waves look if you wish to do so. But that is the way I will leave it for now. The lava texture, I typically don't like making the lava texture from scratch. I like keeping it the lava texture itself, unless I want to make a very specific scene where I need like a specialized lava. But here it's pretty basic, so here what we're going to do is we're just going to remove all of this, because it's all hullabaloo, and we're going to plug a principled node in to this color, and we're going to plug this into here. So now we just have basically this. So lava is obviously a glowing object, so we're going to want to turn this up and this down. And now we're going to want to throw a hue saturation value node, plug this into there, so it's using the value of the texture, into the emission. And now from here we can adjust how much the lava glows. I believe I have bloom on. Yes, I do. So from here we can adjust how much the lava glows. So we can set this to a value of like, I don't know, 10. And now the lava will glow very intensely. It will create a lot of light, as you can see here. It is definitely emitting light. The lava is definitely emitting light. And if you turn the subsurface, the subsample for things emitting light is mesh light. So if you turn mesh light up to 2, you notice the ray tracing that the light of the lava will be a lot more precise than it was before. Now, obviously, this doesn't look very good. You have the lava kind of looks kind of eh. The lava looks very bright, very over exposed. And if you were to throw this into the compositor and do some bloom, it would look like this. It'd be so bright. And also the light coming out, it seems a little bit too orange for the color that we're seeing. So this is where we're going to customize this a little bit. Probably wondering, how are you going to do that? It's pretty simple. We're going to duplicate the hue saturation value node, and we're going to use 2 hue saturation value nodes, and we're going to mix the 2 of them together using a mix node, not mix shader, mix RGB, which is mixing 2 colors together. And we're going to set this to, I believe, no, just mix. We're setting it to mix. And now we're going to use a node called light paths. And the light path node allows you to basically cheat the way lighting works in most cases that you use it. We're going to take a part of the light path node called isCameraRay. Now, isCameraRay basically makes it so that one of these is visible to the camera and one of these is invisible to the camera, but both of them still affect the material. So now one of these values actually changes the way that the thing looks and one of them doesn't. In this case, the one on the bottom is the one we actually see. So the one we actually see, we want to make it at least a little bit glowy. So maybe something like 3 or 4. I'm thinking 4. And then the top one is the one we actually want to emit light. So let's say we want this to glow really intensely. So let's set this to a value like, I don't know, 50. So now the lava will still look the same to the camera and to the viewer, but the amount of light that the lava emits will be extremely high, despite it not being overexposed. Now obviously this amount of light coming out of the lava is a bit intense. I'd probably leave this at a value of like 20, maybe even lower than that, 15 perhaps. But that's simply how you would do that. And if you want to get rid of that kind of like orangey look where it's a little too orange for your satisfactory, you can just take this saturation and turn it down a bit. That's a little too much. Turn it down to a point where the amount of orange you're getting is a little bit less intense and it's a little bit more of the color that you're actually seeing. So I feel like maybe a little bit higher. Yeah, this looks pretty good for lava. Lava. And with that, that brings me to the end of the specialized materials segment for this part. And that's pretty much all the specialized materials that you really need to know. It's just lava, water, and the leaves and the grass. And then everything else is just up to your judgment what you wish to do. Now, this is very basic noding stuff, which is why I didn't really get into too complicated of like a setup of like anything that I did, which is, it's just basic nodes. I'm going to be making a separate series talking about just nodes, because the node conversation can go on for quite a while. So I probably will make a separate video series after the lighting series is over, dedicated to just node related things. So that look forward to that. In the meantime, I'm going to take a camera. I'm going to take a camera render of everything in the shot now with materials, and we're gonna see how that looks. So I'll check back when that's finished. All right, and this is what it looks like. Obviously, I didn't bump the samples up to the point where they'd be amazing. The quality would look amazing. As you can see, the water is intensely noisy, but everything here is a lot better than it looked like when we last did this. Everything's a lot more detailed now. Everything's a lot more, you know, kind of like everything just looks kind of better with what we have done. So with the other two sceneries we have, the indoor lighting with the outdoor lighting, and also the completely indoor lighting, I'm not going to spend an entire segment devoted to, just talking about stuff that I would do there, because all the knowledge that I just showed you is stuff that you can just carry over to the other stuff. So I'm not really going to be showing that. I will show at the end. I will show at the end of the video. I will show at the end of the video the differences. Or no, I'll show this right now. Actually, I'll show the differences between with materials and without materials, because I'll render a frame with both, and you'll see the difference that it makes with each scene that we've been working with so far. And I want to talk about one more thing. We're going to talk about the volume output, which only is really used in one circumstance, and that is to create mist. So let's add a cube. You can follow along if you will. Let's add a cube, and let's go ahead and make it bigger. And let's make it cover the entire expanse of the map. And then also on the z-axis as well. So it just covers everything in the map. It's one giant cube. Actually, wait, no, I changed my mind. Don't use a cube. Use an icosphere. Use a sphere. We're going to make a sphere and make it as big as the map on all three axes. On the z-axis as well. And make it so that every single side and vertice is covering the map. So you have kind of like, yeah, this is a lot better. Okay. So now what we're going to do is we're going to add a material to this. We're going to delete this node. And we're going to add a node called principled volume. And we're going to plug this into the volume output. And now you can't see anything. Well, we're going to turn density on this thing down to 0. So now it's not rendering any volumetrics. So what we're going to do with this is this basically allows you to create fog, because it's basically allowing you to create density inside of the object's volume. So normal volumetrics are controlled by density, which in this case I don't really want to use because it creates a lot of noise, and you only really need it in specific conditions when volumetrics are, necessary, which I will probably get to in the character lighting video. I'll talk more about volumetrics and how they're important. But in this video, I will talk about emission strength, where you can turn this bad boy up. And what this will do is this will create a nice haze that doesn't really utilize light, but it just creates a haze, and you can turn this to the lowest possible number, 0.001, and turn this value to be a sort of light blue. And in doing this, you have now created fog in your scene. So when I put this out, you can now see that I've created kind of a haze within the scene. Now, obviously, this is a lot of haze. It's an insane amount of haze, and this is the lowest value. It can't get any lower than this, but it can. There is a way to make it lower. To make it lower, you just adjust the value of this color. So if you make this color darker, the haze gets less intense. So just keep adjusting the color, the value of the color until you get a haze that you kind of like. And now, as you can see here, I kind of like this haze where it's like it doesn't really start till like about here. And you kind of get this nice little haze effect. And that's basically it for the nodes in terms of the very basic output of nodes in terms of lighting. You can create the haze, you can create very lively worlds, you can do all sorts of different things. And as you can see, nodes really do make a difference. Materials are important. Don't think that they're not. They're extremely important things when it comes to anything you're doing in Blender. You can't fully make Blender lighting without the use of materials or nodes. So just keep in mind, just have an open mind and think about what you're doing when it comes to making materials. And right now, I will display for you on the screen what the two different things look like. The two other scenes look like when I add materials. Both, I'm going to display both of them without materials and then right after with materials for both the indoor lighting and the indoor with outdoor lighting also involved. I would go over like how to do that individually, but you can just use the same common sense that I used in this scene and just transfer it over and use your own common judgment to, you know, figure out the ways and which ways of each one. And with that, we have reached the end of the node video. I was originally going to try to pack way more into this video and explain way more about noding than I actually ended up doing. But the raw recording is already an hour and 3 minutes long, so I'm not going to try to pack more into this. This is just where it's going to end. Yeah, noding is a very complicated process. There's a lot more to it than I've talked about in this video, which is why I'm going to create a whole separate video series on just nodes. But for the basic lighting, the basic lighting mechanics, all you really need to know is this kind of stuff, which is why this video is in the lighting tutorial video, because I'm talking about all the nodes that's related to lighting. I will talk about cooler things that you can do with nodes when you want to create kind of specialized objects, such as like wet things and like water on another block, stuff like that. All sorts of cool things. I'm gonna do a whole video series on just that. And but for now, this is the end of the node video. I believe the next one on the list, this is the third one, there's gonna be 5 in total. Or no, 6 in total. I believe the next one on the list is character lighting, followed by compositing, and then the 6th video is gonna be like the just bonus stuff video. So I'll see you in the next video. I know this video took a really long time, but it's just the way it is at this point. I'm just not even gonna try to find an excuse for this, but alright, see you in the next one.